I want to begin by remarking on something, which is the presence of this individual we're going to talk about this evening, Zheng He. Why are we giving a talk on him at all? When I was at school, he didn't feature. Christopher Columbus was in our global Ferdinand Magellan was in our accounts of the discovery of the world. It was even occasionally mentioned that there might have been some Arab Muslim explorers who were significant too. I don't recall Ibn Battuta, who's next week's topic, being mentioned by name, but I think we were given some sense that that people like him might have been significant. But nobody ever mentioned Zheng He. So what's changed? Well, one reason why they perhaps, one excuse for not mentioning him is he's not actually an explorer. He was covering routes, he was traveling, his 7 expeditions were covering routes that had already been covered by people in the previous century coming the other way. Ibn Battuta, who I just mentioned, is the Moroccan explorer who is the subject of the next session of this sequence of talks, came the other way and reached China 100 years previously. So in that sense, perhaps one reason for excluding Zheng He from these visions of human understanding of the shape of the world is that Zheng He was not an explorer in that sense. But I think there are some better reasons why things have changed, why now you can't have a series of talks about great navigators or great expeditions, great maritime expeditions, without mentioning this individual. One, of course, is China's rise. When I first went to China in the 90s, China's growth, China's future dominance was a confident but still hazardous prediction. It's now evidently come to pass. That change is one reason why Chinese representatives of any particular category of person, be it explorer or others, are now more likely to feature. Something else that's happened is an anniversary. 1405 was the date of the command for the first of these 7 expeditions to take place. The 600th anniversary of that first expedition happened, of course, in 2005. And that anniversary marked the start of what one might want to refer to as Zheng He fever, an enthusiasm for this particular individual, which has still not really gone away. And of course, it's an ongoing anniversary. These expeditions continued over a 3-decade span. So we're actually still in the middle of the 600th anniversary of Zheng He's expeditions. Right now, he'd be preparing for his, 600 years ago right now, he'd be preparing for his 4th expedition. And there's one other reason why I think we're here tonight, and it has its comical side. And let me begin with a slide. Can I ask for a show of hands? I know it's dark now, but I can still see you. How many people have read this book? Right, okay. Actually, fewer than I thought. Nevertheless, even those of you who haven't are probably here because of this book. And that's not because this book gets its facts straight. It doesn't get its facts straight. The book includes a number of remarkable claims. It tells the story. It tells the very, very exciting story of Zheng He, but it also embroiders it in various ways which the author claims are factual. It claims that he reached the United States, or rather the Americas. It claims that he reached Australia. It claims that he and his colleagues traveled to the poles, that they solved the longitude problem, that they achieved numerous other things that the sources simply don't support. But we do, although this book has very little going for it in terms of scholarship, it was incredibly influential. It sold very, very well, and a lot of people, and a lot of very surprising people, were taken in by it. The Economist magazine gave it a very positive write-up. The Library of Congress invited the author and a number of other of his colleagues to come and outline their thesis. My mother was taken in by it. And somebody who one really would be surprised to find being taken in. Not a lot of people know this, but Hu Jintao, the Chinese head of state, on a state visit to Australia, was also taken in by this book written by an Englishman in 2003. He said, when addressing the Australian Parliament, "The Chinese people have all along cherished amicable feelings about the Australian people. back in the 1420s, remember 1421 is the title of the book, the expeditionary fleets of China's Ming Dynasty reached Australian shores. For centuries, the Chinese sailed across vast seas and settled down in what was called the Southern Land, or today's Australia. And there you can see, I think that's probably John Howard and his cabinet looking utterly bemused, wondering whether perhaps something has been lost in translation. But as for if it's in Hansard, so this was accurately this is the official record of what was said in the Australian Parliament in 2003, the year after the publication of Gavin Menzies' book. Extraordinary. So for these reasons, let me just diverge for a second. One of the bits of advice that was given to me before I tackled preparing for this talk was don't be too scholarly about it. Now, the problem is when we've got a book like 1421 that we need to take on and set, when we have a record that needs setting straight, we've got to be a little bit scholarly. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is actually trying to crack open some of the old books, unrolling some old maps, scrutinizing some inscriptions, and even looking at a painting or two, in order to show us how we know what we know about Zheng He's voyage. We're not just going to tell the story, but we're also going to show why Gavin Menzies and Hu Jintao and my mother were mistaken in thinking that he had actually reached the United States. We need to do a little bit of a very brief romp through Ming Dynasty history in order to get the background straight. The image you can see on the screen is of the Hongwu Emperor, the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, who in 1367 overthrows the previous Mongol dynasty. He rises, by the way, from absolute poverty, unable even to raise the resources to bury his own parents when they died, throws himself on the mercy of a Buddhist monastery, joins a band of rebels, and eventually, through the successful military exploits of this band of rebels, rises to be emperor of one of the greatest dynasties the world's ever known, the Chinese Ming Dynasty. It's during his reign that our hero, Zheng He, is born. Now, Zheng He wasn't born Zheng He. He was born Ma He, so his surname was Ma, a common surname of Chinese Muslims. And Zheng He was a Muslim, or rather Ma He, as he began, was a Muslim. Not particularly unusual. There have always been, since Islam has been around, there have been a lot of Muslims in China, and also of particular relevance to our topic this evening, because of the role of Muslim navigators in both the earlier expeditions of the previous century. We mentioned Ibn Battuta on the previous slide, but also the role of those very same Muslim navigators in bringing Zheng He and his crew back towards the Middle East. Our next emperor, we're going to skip a few minor reigns, but one reign, we're going to skip one reign here and move to the Yongle emperor. Now, he was one of the sons of the gentleman on the previous screen, the Hongwu emperor, but he was not the legitimate heir. The legitimate heir was a grandson of the Hongwu emperor on the previous screen, and his position was usurped by Yongle, who was his uncle. And it's during Yongle's reign that 6 of the 7 voyages take place. We now need, and it's because of the special relationship between Zheng He and this individual, the Yongle emperor, that the voyages took place at all. Not only was he a Muslim and therefore distinctive in that sense, he was also distinctive in being a eunuch, that's to say, a castrated male palace servant. And he was a castrated male palace servant of this particular emperor. Before he became emperor, while he was still up near Beijing as a warlord in that region, he recruited the young Zheng He to be, or rather Ma He, to be his household servant as a castrated man. The circumstances of Zheng He's castration are not entirely clear. It usually happened when children as a child rather than as an adult, and so but he entered Yongle's service in his teens. It's the Yongle emperor who grants Zheng He this surname, Zheng. So the surname is a gift from the emperor to him. So he ceases being Ma He, this usual Muslim surname Ma, and gets the surname Zheng. We need one more emperor, and that's the Xuan De emperor, the final one of our list. The last of Zheng He's voyages takes place under his reign. Okay, so there's our potted early Ming Dynasty history. Hongwu, the founder. Yongle, the great dynamic successor under whose reign most of the voyages take place, 6 of the 7. And then finally Xuande, who in fact dies in the same year as Zheng He. Well, I've said that Gavin Menzies is mistaken, and I've said that there were 7 voyages, and I've said that they took place between 1405 and 1731. How do we know that? How do we know that, and how do we know that Gavin Menzies is wrong? Well, one reason is because Zheng He told us, and this rather remarkable monument that I'm going to show you on the next screen, located down in that red circle down at the bottom, on the coast of Fujian province, just opposite, on the Taiwan Straits, tells us in Zheng He's own words the story of these 7 expeditions. And it's one of multiple documents that we're going to have a quick go at looking at this evening to show exactly how we know when these voyages took place, where they went, and what happened on them. There are 2 circles on that image, on this map. This is to help us orientate ourselves. Nanjing is the more northerly of those 2 circles. This was the Hongwu Emperor, the Ming Dynasty founder's capital, the first Chinese capital to be located south of the Changjiang River. The capital was subsequently, during Yongle's reign, relocated to Beijing. And in fact, the forbidden city that you can wander around today in Beijing is a legacy of Yongle's architectural projects in Beijing. But the capital for the Hongwu reign is in Nanjing. And it was in Nanjing that Nanjing remained the financial capital after the move of the capital north. And it's also the base for the starting point for Zheng He's voyages. Now, the southern circle is an entirely minor location on the south coast of Fujian. But in 1935, an inscription, a stele, a stone monument with an engraved Chinese text on it, came to light. And amongst others, Professor Goodrich of Columbia University, who was in China at the time, was able to obtain a rubbing of this, which you can see on the left-hand side of this screen. And it's got a lengthy Chinese text that tells us a great deal in Zheng He's own voice about his expeditions. I'm going to return to this document repeatedly, borrowing different sections. So I'm not going to give away about everything that it says yet, but we're going to begin with the bit that anchors us in this key story of the journeys of Zheng He out into the ocean. The barbarians from beyond the seas, though their countries are truly distant, with double translation have come to audience, bearing precious objects and presents. The emperor, approving of their loyalty and sincerity, has ordered us, He, that's Zheng He, and others, at the head of several tens of thousands of officers and flag troops, to ascend more than 100 large ships, to go and confer presents on them in order to make manifest the transforming power of the imperial virtue, and to treat distant people with kindness. There's lots to be said about this, but first of all, the point is that this entire text is in the voice of Zheng He. He's telling us where he went, when he went there, and what happened. The other, with double translation, is an interesting phrase. The point here is that you're traveling so far and into such unfamiliar territory that you actually require 2 levels of interpreters to make sense of the people that you meet there. So that's what our double translators are. And of course, many of them would have been travelers from the Islamic world who were experienced traveling to the Persian Gulf, which is where they end up. The other important point to note is that this is a military expedition. This is a large scale, 100 ships is the figure here. There are different figures for different texts, but here we've got a figure of 100 ships. And several tens of thousands of officers, meaning soldiers. This is a military expedition on a vast scale. And the aim is also made clear, although one needs to read through the rhetoric a little bit, but this point about making manifest the transforming power of the imperial virtue, I think you can imagine what that might mean. It goes on. So from the 3rd year of Yongle, so there's our date. That's how we know it was 1405 when this first mission was sent out. So from the 3rd year of Yongle till now, we have 7 times received the commission to be ambassadors to the countries of the Western Ocean. Now, the Western Ocean just means all Southeast Asia and beyond. That's what the Western Ocean means. 7 times. There's our figure for the number of voyages. That's where that comes from. The barbarian countries which we have visited are, and then there's a long list telling us exactly where we've been. In Chinese, of course, and there's a bit of translation required there. We'll look at that later. Altogether, more than 30 countries, large and small. So that's how many places he claims to have visited. And then it goes through each voyage one by one. Where was the date, the year of the voyage, where it was, where they traveled to, and what happened on the voyage. And those are the lists of dates. As you can see, they were an extremely busy group of people, led by Zheng He, but also accompanied by other eunuchs, some of whom also, on their return, left documentary accounts of their voyage. By the way, the one I've highlighted in red, 1421, is that year in which Gavin Menzies claims they reached both Australia and the Americas. Funny that they didn't mention it in this inscription. In the 19th year of Yongle, so this is in 1421, this is our year, right? In the 19th year of Yongle, commanding the fleet, we conducted the ambassadors from Hormuz and the other countries who had been in attendance at the capital for a long time back to their countries. The kings of all these countries prepared even more tribute than previously, right? So that there's our ultimate destination, the Persian Gulf, and then also a little bit, as we'll see later, a little bit down the coast of Africa. No, if they had been elsewhere, we would expect to find it in this inscription. Let's keep going. The 6th year of Xuande, that's the date of that's the last voyage setting out. The cyclical year Xinhai, that's another way of mentioning the same date. That's we go 1431 to 1432. On a lucky day, erected by the principal envoys, the grand eunuchs Zheng He and Wang Jinghong, the assistant envoys, the grand eunuchs Li Xing, Zhou Liang, Zhou Man, Hong Bao, Yang Zhen, Zhang Da, Wu Zhong, and the commanders Zhu Zhen and Wang Hong. So an expedition led by eunuchs, leaving as they set out on their final voyage this stone inscription on the coast of Fujian. Why the coast of Fujian? Why this inscription at all? We'll come back to that later. But as you can see, I don't know whether, here's another question. Some of you had read the 1421 book. I wonder how many people saw the PBS documentary, a dramatized life of Zheng He. It's there on YouTube, or it's there online somewhere. The opening scene is a nighttime scene with officials racing to burn the documents that recorded the voyage of Zheng He. And there are some hints that something like that might have taken place. But the implication drawn from this possible burning of certain documents was that the entire documentary record was lost. That was what enabled people like Gavin Menzies to construct this story around a hole and around an absence of evidence. But I think we've already seen that there is no absence of evidence. There is an abundant documentary record. So this is the stele left as they depart on their final 7th voyage on the coast at a minor location on the coast of Fujian, opposite Taiwan. Let's look at a map now. The other thing that Zheng He left behind, or rather his team left behind after their final return, were maps of where they'd been. And again, the United States and Australia don't appear on them. To find them, we need to look, the originals don't survive, but a 1621 military encyclopedia, the so-called Treatise on Military Preparedness, does survive by an author called Mao Yuanyi. Now, it also doesn't survive in its original version. And the one I'm going to put on the screen now is a 1792 Japanese edition. So this is, again, a very important point to make here, is that this knowledge that Zheng He brought back was not only not lost, but it was disseminated throughout East Asia. And people had access to it in Japan in the 18th century. They knew where Zheng He had been. So let's take a look. It only mentions Zheng He very briefly, but it has an explicit statement that the maps involved here are connected with Zheng He. So that the volume 238 of this vast encyclopedia that runs to 240 volumes, Navigating the Seas. At that time, Zheng He, serving the court as a eunuch, didn't fail in his mission. His charts list routes and distances and nations and lands, in detail but without error, recorded to enlighten ages to come and to commemorate his military merit. And that's the block of text that you can see highlighted on the screen there. And if we turn the page, the maps begin. So we're beginning to look at an 18th century woodblock edition of a 17th century military encyclopedia that preserves for us the maps that Zheng He's team brought back. So let's have a look. The rectangle in the center is Nanjing. The label is Huangcheng, meaning the glorious city, the illustrious city. And that's Nanjing. That's Hongwu's capital, and then subsequently the second major city in China after the move to Beijing. The other rectangle over to the right is labeled as the shipyard. It's the shipyard where the great so-called treasure ships, these enormous ships that led this fleet of 100, were constructed. And that red line that you can see snaking away is the beginning of the journey, moving, right to left across the page. That's the passage of the ships as they leave Nanjing and as they leave the shipyard. Now, as I've already said, this is a woodblock printed book, right? So each of those rectangles you can see on either side was a woodblock, right? And that's how books in China and in Japan would have been produced. That's how the original 17th century encyclopedia would have been produced. But let's begin to, and you'll also notice, I think, that there's a space in the middle. So we'll begin to put these wood blocks together and see what we get. There's the first page. So there we got Nanjing. That's what we had on the previous page, but I've eliminated the white space in between those two wood blocks. And if we turn the page and turn over to the next page and attach that one too, we begin to continue this map, to continue this path, traveling down the Yangtze River away from Nanjing. And it goes on. So there's the flip side of the same page. And I think you can begin to see what this originally was. Originally, this wasn't a sequence of woodblock illustrations. Originally, this was a scroll that unrolled from right to left and would presumably have run to something like 5 meters long, a very, very lengthy. If I didn't go to the task of putting all of these images together, that would have been very, very difficult to see. But this was originally a scroll that's been transferred from one medium to another. It's been transferred to the medium of the woodblock print. And there we go. There's that line that links all of these images together is the path that these ships took. There we go. That's the ones on the previous screen. We'll do it for a bit longer, until we get tired of this particular exercise. So how many have we got there? We've got 8. That's 8 wood blocks. We've got the line that is always there, the line that the ships passed along in their voyage. How far have we got? 8 pages through. In fact, not very far. We're just past Shanghai. Here's the first thing to notice. Now, look, on this one, we're going from right to left, right, more or less in a straight line. On this map, we've started at, do I have a pointer on here? Oh, can you all see that pointer? Pointing at Nanjing? Right. That's where we started. That's where the shipyard is. In fact, rather than going right to left, we're going left to right, down the Changjiang River, down to the mouth near where it wasn't called, there wasn't a Shanghai then, but there is now, and we've all heard of it. So there's Shanghai. That's how far they've got in eight images. Putuoshan, which is a tourist site off the coast today. About approximately there. We're not even as far as Taiwan yet. Going at that rate to get all the way to the east coast of Africa I did a rough calculation, something like 200, 400 wood blocks would be required for that. And that's the other interesting thing about the map. Not only does it rotate north and west according to the direction of the passage of the ships. In the scroll, in the original scroll, because it's a scroll, it's a long, thin document, the line of travel can only be represented in one direction. And so, effectively, north and south are rotating as you move along this scroll. That's not the only change. The scale shifts as you go. So for areas that were very, very close to Nanjing, very, very well understood, where all the place names were familiar, we get a lot of detail, we get a different scale. And the scale gradually pans out as you move along the scroll until eventually you arrive, in Africa. There we go, long way to go, right? Again, where's my pointer? So we're about there at the moment. And we've got all of Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa still to do. Let's keep following the story along a little bit further. Here, I don't know how well you can see the images here, but again, the dotted line is the line followed by the ships. Now, there are alternatives in this particular case. There's another one, the second one there, but they're still following the Chinese coast. This location is the location where that inscription was placed. So the maps record the location, the temple, in fact, where that stone inscription that we saw on the previous screen it was and is located. Here's Canton, modern Guangdong province. Hong Kong Island is somewhere around there. It's not labeled as such, but it's probably one of those small blobs that you can see on the screen. So we're still, we're now, after leaving the coast of China, we then move down the coast of Vietnam, and there are a number of bifurcations in the route, splits in the route, alternative paths that one can take. And of course, this map is a summary of all 7 voyages put together, of all of the paths that were taken on these 7 different voyages. So that's why there are multiple routes represented in it. And once we leave, well, by the way, while we're in China, while we're going down the coast past Fujian, past Taiwan, off to Canton, past Hong Kong, all the place names are Chinese place names, and most of them are still here today. Easy to match up. But as soon as we leave China, as soon as we start passing into Southeast Asia and then ultimately into the Indian Ocean, the names are foreign but represented in the Chinese script. And that has been one of the scholarly challenges in interpreting these documents once they began to attract attention, was matching up these Chinese pronunciations with what we think were the historical pronunciations of place names along the route. It's an entertaining exercise. Let's see how we do. There are 3 on here, right? The first one, Chihuahua. Any guesses? Java. Okay, so dead easy. Some of them are extremely straightforward, and so the Chinese pronunciation matches the contemporary name. Here's a slightly more difficult one. Manlaga. What have we got? I think I heard of Manchuria. Malacca. Okay, brilliant. There we go. Somebody who knows how you get from Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean via the Straits of Malacca. Where in between Malaysia, the words Malaysia and Singapore, is a labelled point, Malacca, pronounced Manlaja or Manlaga. Last one, Sumandala. Yeah, pretty good. So it's actually being used to refer to the northern end of the island that's now referred to as Sumatra. But yeah, so there are names on these maps that can be very readily matched up. So again, don't let anyone tell us that we don't know exactly where these people went. The documentary record is extremely detailed. I've just put 3 examples. This entire map is spattered with Chinese place names in the original map that's preserved in the 17th century encyclopedia. These are pretty easy too. Bangala. Bengal, right? Bengal or Bangladesh. It's preserved in both of those names, where, incidentally, one of Zheng He's expeditions managed to resolve a succession crisis amongst the kings of Bengal on their visit. They got up to similar things in Xilan, again, not particularly difficult, Sri Lanka, right? Xilan, or Ceylon, as it used to be referred to as. Interestingly, have we got the image? The Japanese edition, this would never have happened in a Chinese text, but the woodblock cutter has mistranscribed Sri Lanka. It's a minor point, but the characters appear. Where are they? There we go. He's written Tanglan instead of Xilan. But anyway, so there we go. On the right-hand side is a blow-up of the island of Sri Lanka, with several features prominently displayed. 2 Buddhist temples. Yeah, the Hall of the Buddha up here, and the Hall of the Buddha down at the bottom. And this object that you can see on the screen was something that Zheng He was bringing with him on his voyage. This he had made before he set out. And I should say also, he'd been to Ceylon, Sri Lanka previously, and had not had a particularly pleasant exchange with the ruler at the time on his first voyage, and had left in something of a hurry. But he was now returning on his 3rd voyage, bringing this object that you can see on your screen with him. This object is in Colombo. It's in the museum. I haven't. The image on the right shows it in the museum in Colombo. It wasn't discovered until 1911. Astonishingly, it was found used as a cover for a drain, and it was originally standing in one of those 2 temples that you saw illustrated in Zheng He's map on the previous screen. A temple that had been visited by Ibn Battuta in the previous century. He'd been to Sri Lanka too. I remember I said that Zheng He didn't discover anything. Ibn Battuta had been to all these places previously. Well, Sri Lanka is a good example of that. Somebody else who got there were the Portuguese, who in fact destroyed the temple in question, and it's presumably when that at that moment of destruction that this stele became lost. But you can also see there are various reasons why it might not have been a particularly treasured item in Sri Lanka, and we'll see why in a second. But first of all, just to emphasize what an extraordinary object this is, it's a Tamil, Persian, Chinese trilingual inscription. How many of those are there from the 15th century? I think this is probably the only one. And it's more or less intact. The Persian is largely effaced, very, very difficult to read, apparently. They thought it must be an Arabic script, because it was originally thought to be Arabic. But the Chinese is entirely legible. And this is what it says. Sorry, we do have to read it, because it makes good reading. His Majesty, the Emperor of the Great Ming Dynasty, has dispatched the eunuchs, Zheng He, Wang Jinghong, and others, to set forth his utterances before Lord Buddha. So not before the Sri Lankans, but to bring this, to make a Buddhist pilgrimage to this temple, bringing this stone stele with them. Deeply do we revere you, merciful and honored one, that's the Buddha, whose bright perfection is wide-embracing and whose way of virtue passes all understanding. The mountainous isle of Sri Lanka lies in the south of the ocean, and its Buddhist temples are sanctuaries of your gospel, where your miraculous responsive power imbues and enlightens. So flattering words targeted at the Buddha. And then we get down to business. Of late, we've dispatched missions to announce our mandates to foreign nations. And during their journey over the ocean, they've been favored with the blessing of your beneficent protection. An interesting aspect of the Voyages is how, promiscuous they were in their religion. We've said that Zheng He was at least born a Muslim. His father had been on the Hajj, was definitely grown up a Muslim. We assume that he was too. And yet here we have him bringing a Buddhist stele for strategic reasons, because Sri Lanka was a Buddhist state, or rather the location of Buddhist states, and that's why they're bringing a Buddhist object with them. So, of late, we've dispatched missions to announce our mandates to foreign nations, and during their journey over the ocean, they've been favored with the blessings of your beneficent protection. They've escaped disaster and misfortune and journeyed in safety to and fro. In everlasting recognition of your supreme virtue, we therefore bestow offerings in recompense. So they've come to Sri Lanka with this object and with offerings of the kind that you'd want to give if you were endowing a very, very important Buddhist temple. 1,000 bars of gold, incense, silk hangings, incense burners, objects of that kind. And they brought all this to deliver to the temple, presumably with the intention of currying favor with the local patrons of the temple. That would make sense. But this text is not addressed to those local patrons, it's addressed to the Buddha. So, to say thank you for the safe voyage. May his light shine upon the donors. Now, the donors are the Chinese, right? The donors are the Ming expedition. So, asking for thanks when they get to Sri Lanka, or rather asking for protection from the Buddha when they arrive in Sri Lanka. And this was in the 7th year of Yongle, 1410. So this is the third of the expeditions. And what happened? Well, we can go back to our other stele, back in Fujian, to find out what the outcome of this event was. Third voyage. In the 7th year of Yongle, 1409, so that's the year before they arrive in Sri Lanka, commanding the fleet, we went to the countries visited before and took our route by the country of Xilan, right, that's Ceylon. Its king, Alagak Konara, was guilty of a gross lack of respect and plotted against the fleet. The plot was discovered, and thereupon that king was captured alive. In the 9th year, 1411, on our return, he was presented to the emperor. So he's kidnapped. The king is, there's a battle, the city's destroyed, the king is put on one of these ships and taken off back to China. On our return, he was presented to the emperor as a prisoner. Subsequently, he received the imperial favor of returning to his own country. So the emperor is gracious about it and sends him back on a subsequent trip. The Sri Lankan version of events, as you might imagine, is not quite the same. Now, my grasp of Sri Lankan sources is not strong, so I'm reliant on whatever source I used for this particular translation. But it makes sense. During the reign of King Alagak Konara, Dos Raja, I don't know why the Emperor of China is being called Dos Raja, but anyway, the Raja presumably is King Dos. I don't know what that means. Maybe somebody who, with the linguistic skills, would be able to tell me what that means. Anyway, he's the King of Great China, the Ming Emperor. No, he's not. Sorry. It says he landed in Lanka, so this presumably is Zheng He. Dosraja, king of Great China, landed in Lanka, in Ceylon, with an immense army, and under pretext of bringing presents and curiosities, craftily carried away King Alaka Gokonara. So that's the same name. Who fell into his hands, foolishly thinking that he also brought presents, as other foreign princes had previously. Right? So thinking that these guys are showing up with gifts, then gets kidnapped and taken away. His 4 younger brothers were killed. Taking many captives, Dosraja returned to Great China. So yeah, an interesting point that I slipped up there. Dosraja is, they're calling him the king of China and claiming that he actually arrived, but this presumably is Zheng He, or one of the other leaders of this expedition that brought the steles. I think you're beginning to get quite a good sense. This is partly a debunking exercise. We've already tried to take on Gavin Menzies. But he's not the only one who occasionally presents a less than fully accurate account of these events. For example, the title of that book leaves something to be desired. Given what we've just understood, this is a book that was again published during the Zheng He fever around the 600th anniversary of the first expedition, peace missions on a grand scale. Well, that trip to Sri Lanka was not a peace mission. Our journey continues. Guli that's a difficult one. Calicut on the west coast of India. Hulumosi, in the Persian Gulf, the Hormuz, right? Hormuz. Now, Hormuz is actually the end of the scroll. If you keep going with the scroll, it's the last woodblock print. It's the end of. It's the point you get to when you finally unroll the scroll. And the interesting thing that happens is that you then start moving back along the scroll in order to get down the east coast of Africa. Again, we've got this rubber sheet topology going on with scales and orientations and even doubling back on oneself, all being represented in this very, very long linear format. So as we move down the east coast of Africa now, we're actually moving back towards the beginning of the scroll. Does that make sense? It might make sense with the next slide. Anyway, two more locations. Mogadishu. Mogadishu, exactly. It's still there. It's off in Somalia. In Somalia. And the last one is Malindi. Now, I don't know what that matches up with, but that's the last point on the African coast, as recorded by this map. As recorded by this map preserved in the 17th century encyclopedia. There's our map. Actually, that's the same image as the one we saw previously. Sri Lanka with the Buddhist temples, right? The 2 Buddhist temples on either end of the island, and just across that small expanse of water, the east coast of Africa. So what's happened here? But there is a logic to it. This is not an irrational map. This is a very, very clever map. That the lines at the top are the routes going outwards. And when you get to Hormuz, you double round on that scroll and come back in order to move down the east coast of Africa. It's not in any sense a misrepresentation of where they were. It's actually a very, very clever way of representing the surface of a sphere, after all, in a linear format. What have we got here? Oh yes, navigate. You've noticed there's text along the lines. Remember, these dotted lines are the paths taken by these ships. This is a record of the routes they followed, and you can see there's text following some of those. Those are descriptions of how to navigate the route. They begin. I'm wondering whether any of these are actually large enough for me to read, but they begin with a destination. They then tell you how long you have to keep on that course. So they begin with a destination, then it's followed by a compass point. Now, the Chinese compass is divided up into 24 15-degree divisions. So by specifying any one of those symbols that you can see arrayed around that circle, around that compass circle, you can specify any of those 24 divisions. Or you can specify 2 adjacent ones together, which means halfway in between the 2. And that's what these maps are doing. That's what that text is saying. It's recording the orientation of the compass needle when you're following that particular path. It also records distance in terms of the passage of time. So if you're following a route, it records the amount of time it takes to travel that distance. It also records, and this is fascinating, it records the altitude of stars using, and this is a reconstruction by a modern Chinese scholar, but using a set of these wooden plates. You hold a plate of the right size at arm's length, with the bottom of the square on the horizon So that the top of the square aligns with the star in question. And that gives you a measure, because depending on the size of plate you choose, a measure of the angular altitude of that star, which you can use to answer latitude questions. If you want to know where you are in terms of latitude, you can use this scheme. And that's what all that text is that you can see scribbled along those lines, those dotted lines on the map. Divine assistance. Now, we've already seen that they appealed to the Buddha in Sri Lanka, and we've already heard that Zheng He and many of his colleagues were Muslim. But they also appealed to yet another divinity. And that I concealed this from you when I talked about the establishment of that stele early on, because I just wanted to get to the facts of the story. But that stele was also dedicated to a deity, not to the god of Islam, and not to the Buddha, but to the celestial spouse. Don't know if anyone's ever heard of her before, but that's what the title, the 6 characters up at the top of the inscription say. The record of the miraculous answer, that's the meaning answer to prayer, of the goddess, the celestial spouse, because she responded to the prayer of Zheng He and his colleagues. That's why they put this inscription up on the coast of Fujian in that obscure temple that's dedicated to her. And it reads like this. This is a different section of the same inscription. The power of the goddess, having indeed been manifested in previous times, has been abundantly revealed in the present generation. In the midst of the rushing waters, it happened that when there was a hurricane, suddenly there was a divine lantern shining in the mast. And as soon as this miraculous light appeared, the danger was appeased, so that even in the peril of capsizing, one felt reassured that there was no cause for fear. And this is what I mean about this group of people being promiscuous in their religions. Whichever divinity helps you out on these perilous voyages is the divinity that you end up erecting a stele to, and whose temple you end up patronizing. And she's well known in Chinese, in coastal China and in Chinese Southeast Asia. There are still practicing temples to the celestial spouse today. Here's one. This is the one in Nanjing, a reconstruction, in fact, of the original one, but it was founded by Zheng He on his return. Here's a statue of her on Jinmen Island off the coast of Taiwan, in between Taiwan and the Fujian coast, looking out over the sea. She's a goddess who protects sailors. That's who the celestial spouse is. The story goes is that she was a young girl in the Song Dynasty. That's 2 dynasties prior to the Ming Dynasty, so in the 10th century. And she had a dream. Her family were fishermen. Her father and brothers were out at sea, and there was a terrible storm. And in a dream during the storm, she sees them all, and she's able to rescue them in the dream. And she's woken up, just as she's bringing them back to land in her dream, she's woken up by her mother, who hears her screaming and distressed in her sleep. And because she's woken up at the last minute, she drops the last brother. So that's the story of the celestial spouse. And this is the beginning of the story, and then she becomes a deified figure and is the subject of cult throughout a great deal of Southeast Asia today, including the South China coast. Now, for a light-hearted end to this, because 15th century China is a long way away, let's have a Philadelphia connection. Now, we've already been doing a pretty good job of coping with this double translation and the lost in double translation. What do you think the Zulafa is? What's a Zulafa? It comes from Africa. And it's got a Philadelphia connection, because it's actually come all the way here too. The 5th voyage, this is back to our stele, the stele to the celestial spouse. 5th voyage, the country of Aden. Now we know where that is. The country of Aden presented qilin. That's a Chinese word. The Japanese call them kirin, right? Like the beer. Presented qilin, of which the native name is Zulafa. Any guesses? That's Zulafa. They have long necks. Right. Okay, this guy. He's currently in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is probably not the original of the painting, like a lot of these documents we've been looking at. The steles are an exception, but the ones on paper and more fragile materials tend to be later copies of the original. But 3 of these creatures were brought back, both by the Zheng He missions and also as tribute from other areas. This particular example, as you can see, there's some text up at the top there. This particular example came, it says in the inscription, from Bangla, right, from Bengal. Now, there aren't any giraffes in Bengal, but presumably this giraffe had been on a ship from somewhere like Aden or from the east coast of Africa, which is where giraffes come from, had been transferred to the royal menagerie in Bengal and had then subsequently been given as a gift by the King of Bengal to one of these passing expeditions and brought back to Nanjing, which is where it was seen, celebrated by the emperor, and who had this painting, or an earlier version of it, painted. By the way, Pacey, Gavin Menzies, there were no kangaroos in the imperial menagerie. They were giraffes, but no kangaroos. There are lots of these around. There's another one in the Metropolitan Museum. You can see evidently based on the same original image, but minus its text. Other examples of this is an embroidered silk rank badge that also has a representation of a giraffe. Giraffes are not a Chinese animal, but there we go. There's a representation of one, and it's thanks to these voyages that these animals began to arrive. But let's go back to that. Let's go back to that line from the inscription again. So the country of Aden presented qilin, of which the native name is Zulafa. So Zulafa is a giraffe. So what's a qilin or a kirin? Japanese call them kirin, which may be the name you're more familiar with. Qilin is the Chinese name. Well, old Chinese legend, one of them is said to have appeared at the time of the birth of Confucius, heralding the miraculous birth of a sage. So this is 500 BC we're talking about now. And here's a Ming Dynasty painting showing the qilin, looks nothing like a giraffe, but arriving at Confucius's mother's house, a jade tablet emerges from its mouth, is spat from its mouth, containing the prophecy that you will give birth to Confucius. Another one appears and is hunted to death at the time of Confucius's death. This is Confucius in the same painting, bewailing the fact that the creature has died. So the qilin was an old Chinese mythical creature that had been the subject of art and the subject of literature for a long period of time. It was thought of as heralding the arrival of a sage ruler. And so in an amazing bit of what's the word, propagandistic bricolage, the courtiers in Yongle's court put the story of the qilin together with the arrival of this giraffe and had the giraffe serve as the qilin, the mythical animal that arrives only when a sage ruler has arrived on the stage. So that's what this text at the top of our Philadelphia painting is all about this beast heralding the beginning of a sage rule. The emperor was not that impressed and said, "If my ministers devote themselves to their work day and night and exhaust all efforts to govern the empire and bring benefit to it, the empire will be at peace. Even without a qilin, there is nothing that hinders us from governing well." All right, so thanks, but no thanks. And there it is. There is a non-giraffe qilin appearing on a Japanese beer can. Okay, I'm done, but I'm very happy to take questions to the extent that I'm able to answer them.